Good morning. Today we will see the chapter 5 and 6 of the book War Dispatches Indo-Pak Conflict 1965. The chapters are on close air support and paradrop scare. 1965 Indo-Pak War highlighted the importance of air power in the modern conflict. For the Indian Army, particularly the Western Command, close air support from the Indian Air Force was expected to be critical force multiplier in handling enemy offensives and strengthening ground operations. Given the Pakistan's reliance on the mechanized strike doctrine and the ability of the Indian Air Force to target enemy armor and logistics, uh, it became critical to overcome the several key battles. Enemy threat. Pakistan entered the war with a smaller but technologically more modern air force. They were equipped with F-86 Sabres and F-104 Starfighters. The Pakistan posed a direct threat to the Indian ground forces and supply lines. Pakistan Air Force strikes disrupted Indian logistics, hit roads and rail junctions, and harassed troop concentrations. Its ability to contest airspace in Punjab and Kashmir made air superiority a contested domain throughout the war. Indian Air Force and role and preparations. Pre-war doctrine envisaged Indian Air Force supporting the army, but joint planning was limited. There were very few forward air controllers with ground formations. The communications between Army units and the Indian Air Force bases were slow and often unreliable. Close air support missions were mostly reactive rather than pre planned. Nevertheless, once war began, Indian Air Force launched offensive strikes against enemy armor, troop concentrations, and supply dumps. So, theater wise, close air support was in Kashmir, 15 Corps. Air support was limited by weather and mountainous terrain. Where available, Indian Air Force strikes disrupted infiltrators, bases, and Pakistani supply lines across the ceasefire line. In Punjab, that is the 11th Corps, during the Battle of Asal Uttar, Karan, Indian Air Force sorties contributed to slowing Pakistan's one armored division, complementing Indian defensive ambushes, and Indian Air Force strikes on Pakistan armor were a morale booster for the Indian troops. In Sialkot, close air support played a role in the large scale tank battles at Phillora and Chawinda, though lack of coordination reduced its effectiveness. Many ground commanders felt support came too late or was insufficient in scale. So challenges in the close air support. First is the weather, of course. The monsoon rains, dust, and poor visibility often grounded aircrafts or reduced targeting accuracy. Coordination gaps. Without trained forward air controllers embedded with the ground troops, communication was slow and imprecise. Delay in response. Close air support often arrived hours after request, by which time the battlefield situation had changed. Friendly fire risk. In some engagements, lack of real time coordination created fear of misdirected strikes. Enemy air interference. Pakistan Air Force interdiction limited Indian freedom of movement and occasionally forced Indian Air Force fighters to engage in defensive air combat instead of ground attack. Indian Air Force inflicted significant damage on Pakistani armor and supply lines, particularly in Punjab. Close air support missions supported Indian victories at Asal Uttar and Phillora, where Indian Air Force strikes added to the destruction of the Patton tanks. The psychological impact of seeing friendly aircraft overhead boosted Indian troops' morale, while Pakistani troops were unsettled by persistent air harassment, limitations, and shortcomings. The scale of close air support fell short of the ground forces' expectations. Reactive operations reduced efficiency in more fast moving tank battles like Chawinda. Air assets were stretched between multi roles, defensive counter air, strategic interdiction, and the close air support. At times, Pakistani ground forces retained greater confidence in their air cover compared to the Indian formations. So, the strategic and psychological impact. Close air support, though imperfect, contributed to halting Pakistan's major offensives. For Indian troops, the sight of Indian aircraft overhead was a morale lifter. Internationally, the Indian Air Force earned recognition for its aggressiveness despite operating with the older aircraft like NAT, Hunter, against Pakistan's US supplied Sabre and Star fighters. Pakistan's belief in quick victory was shaken when its armor was pounded not just by ground forces but also from the air. So, the lesson learned: joint planning, close air support cannot succeed without close Army Air Force coordination at the planning and execution levels. Forward air controllers are important. The absence of forward air controllers was a critical weakness. Their presence in later wars, that is 1971, improved close air support dramatically. Air superiority first. Effective cross air support requires freedom from enemy harassment. Contested skies limited the Indian Air Force ability to fully support ground troops. Logistics and mobility. Sustained air operations require robust logistics, which were strained in 1965. Balance of priorities. The Indian Air Force had to divide resources between close air support, counter air, and the strategic strikes, highlighting the need for clear prioritization. The chapter highlights close air support in 1965 was, was partially effective but far from optimal. While the Indian Air Force delivered critical blows at Asal Uttar and Phillora, overall coordination gaps, limited forward air control, and contested skies reduced its impact. Still, close air support played a vital role in blunting Pakistan's offensive, neutralizing enemy armor, and boosting morale. Their experience directly influenced India's doctrine, leading to far stronger joint air-ground integration in 1971. The Paratroop scare. During 1965 Indo-Pak War, rumors and reports of Pakistani paratroop landing behind Indian lines created widespread alarm across Punjab and other theaters. This phenomena, called the paratroop scare, had a disproportionate psychological and operational impact compared to the actual threat. Pakistan attempted to exploit India's vulnerability in the rear and by threatening airborne commandos raids. A small number of parachute and commando elements were indeed dropped by Pakistan in Punjab and near major communication lines. The aim was to disrupt Indian and communication networks, create panic among the civilians and troops in depth areas, force India to divert frontline forces to guard against an exaggerated airborne threat. So, the initial reports of parachute drops spread rapidly, often exaggerated into claims of hundreds of paratroops landing behind in lines. Villagers frequently mistook the falling flares, aircraft lights, or even the birds for parachute drops and reported them as enemy landings. The scare spread widely across Punjab and Delhi and even deeper into the areas of India, forcing troops and the police mobilization to verify the reports. It, as per the Indian reactions, army and police units were deployed to chase down selected paratroopers in many districts. Civil authorities organized home guards and volunteer groups to assist in searches. In many cases, panic and overreaction drained manpower and attention that could have been better focused on the front. In truth, the actual number of Pakistani troops dropped was small and militarily insignificant. Most were quickly captured or killed after landing. They failed to inflict any serious disruption in India's communication or logistics. However, their psychological effect far exceeded their material capabilities. For several days, large number of Indian soldiers were diverted from front lines to the hunt for the non-existent paratroops. Commanders had to calm troops and civilians to prevent rumors from spreading it further. The scare highlighted weakness in communication and verification system within the civil military framework. Regarding the lessons learned, the psychological warfare works. Even a small airborne threat amplified by rumors can cause large scale panic. Need for better verification. Clearer procedures were required for confirming enemy parachute drops before mobilizing large responses. Civil military coordination, handling civilian panic is as important as tactical response during war. Limited utility of airborne operations. The failure of Pakistani paratroops in the 1965 showed that without strong ground coordination, airborne raids were little more than a nuisance. To conclude, we can say the paratroop scare of 1965 war was less a military threat than a psychological phenomena. A handful of Pakistani paratroopers supported by rumors and fear, managed to tie down disproportionately large Indian resources. While the material damage was negligible, the episode underlined the power of the psychological warfare and need for disciplined communication, civil defense, preparedness, and calm leadership in wartime. The chapter 6 illustrates how war is fought not just by guns and tanks, but also with rumor, fear, and the perception. Paratroop scare was a classic example of how a minor action by the enemy can magnify into a major distraction if not managed with clarity and discipline. So we have finished the chapter 5 and 6 also. We move on to the next chapter in a few days. Thank you.